The air in Little Italy on that crisp October afternoon, the 17th day of 1958, usually hummed with the familiar symphony of life, the clatter of espresso cups, the boisterous laughter from trattorias, the rumble of a passing Cadillac. But on this particular day, a different kind of silence fell, thick and heavy, as an 8-year-old boy, no taller than a bar stool, pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Crimson Clover, Antonio Moretti's private social club. His clothes were threadbare, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes, wide and unwavering, held a fierce, desperate resolve that belied his tender years. Antonio Tony Moretti, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence across the 5 boroughs, sat at his usual corner table, a cloud of expensive cigar smoke swirling around his impeccably tailored Italian suit. His dark eyes, usually sharp and calculating, narrowed slightly as the small figure approached. Around him, the low murmur of his lieutenants and capos died down, replaced by an almost palpable tension. Every man in that room knew that an uninvited guest, especially one so young and seemingly insignificant, was an anomaly, a breach in the carefully constructed order of their world. The boy stopped a few feet from Tony's table, his small chest heaving, not from exertion, but from a raw, unbridled courage. He looked up at the formidable figure of Tony Moretti, past the intricate thorny rose tattoos that snaked up the mob boss's neck, past the glint of the gold watch on his wrist, and met his gaze directly. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet somehow cut through the stunned silence of the room, he uttered words that would echo through the annals of New York's underworld, words that would forever change the trajectory of a powerful man's life. "Mr. Moretti," he began, his voice cracking slightly but holding firm, "I need $5 to bury my mother." The cigar slipped from Tony's fingers, hitting the polished mahogany with a soft thud, and for the first time in a long time, Antonio Moretti was utterly, completely speechless. The world, for a fleeting moment, held its breath. October 17th, 1958. A date etched into the memory of those who lived through it, a day when the rigid lines of power and poverty, of ruthlessness and unexpected compassion, blurred in the heart of Little Italy, New York. The city itself was a character in this unfolding drama, a sprawling metropolis still basking in the post-war boom, yet with its underbelly teeming with shadows and secrets. The scent of simmering tomato sauce mingled with exhaust fumes from sleek Cadillacs and Lincolns, the vibrant chatter of Italian dialects punctuated by the distant wail of a police siren. This was a city of dreams and nightmares, where fortunes were made and lost, and where the unspoken rules of the street often held more sway than any law. At the epicenter of this intricate web was Antonio Tony Moretti. At just 32 years old, Tony was a force to be reckoned with, a man who had ascended to the top of his organization with a blend of sharp intellect, unwavering loyalty, and a reputation for swift, decisive action. He was, by all accounts, a handsome man, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes a piercing shade of brown that seemed to see right through you. His suits, always custom-tailored in the finest Italian fabrics, spoke of power and prosperity. But it was the art etched onto his skin that told a deeper story. Thorny roses climbing his neck, their petals unfurling with a dangerous beauty, and intricate spiderwebs adorning the backs of his hands, symbols of a life lived on the edge, of connections spun and traps laid. Tony Moretti was a king in his domain, his word law, his presence commanding, and then there was Isabella Rossi. Though she had passed, her presence lingered, a ghost of elegance and beauty in the collective memory of the neighborhood. Isabella was known for her striking looks, a classic beauty of the 1950s, with raven hair and eyes that held a quiet strength. She was a woman who, despite her humble circumstances, carried herself with an innate dignity, a grace that left an impression on everyone she met. Her life, though cut short, was a testament to resilience, a quiet struggle against the harsh realities of their world. Her son, Marco Rossi, was the unlikely catalyst for this extraordinary tale. 8 years old, small for his age, Marco possessed a spirit that burned brighter than any street lamp. He was a boy forged in the crucible of hardship, yet unbowed. His courage, born of desperation and an unshakable love for his mother, would lead him to the most dangerous man in New York, armed with nothing but a plea and a profound sense of duty. This was the initial conflict, a child's raw need colliding with the unyielding machinery of organized crime, a moment that would force a powerful man to confront the very essence of his humanity. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. The streets of Little Italy on that autumn day were a vibrant tapestry of life, a sensory overload for anyone who dared to truly experience it. The air was thick with the rich, earthy aroma of garlic and oregano wafting from bustling kitchens, mingling with the sweet, intoxicating scent of freshly brewed espresso and the metallic tang of exhaust from the steady stream of automobiles. A 1957 Cadillac Eldorado, gleaming chrome reflecting the weak afternoon sun, purred past a fruit stand piled high with ruby-red apples and golden-yellow lemons. Women in elegant, cinched waist dresses and men in fedoras and sharp suits moved with purpose, their conversations a melodic blend of English and Italian, punctuated by expressive hand gestures. Children, oblivious to the undercurrents of power and peril, chased each other down cobblestone alleys, their laughter echoing against brick facades. But for Marco Rossi, the usual vibrancy of his neighborhood was muted, seen through a haze of grief and an urgent, singular mission. His small, worn shoes scuffed against the pavement as he navigated the familiar labyrinth of streets, each step a testament to his unwavering resolve. He clutched a crumpled $5 bill in his pocket, not his, but the amount he needed, the impossible sum. His mother, Isabella, had always taught him to be resourceful, to be brave, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He had overheard whispers, hushed conversations among neighbors, about who held the real power, who could make things happen when all other avenues were closed. The name Moretti had been spoken with a reverence that bordered on fear. His journey to the Crimson Clover was a gauntlet of emotion. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at him with every shadow, every unfamiliar face. But beneath it, a burning determination, fueled by the memory of his mother's gentle smile and her last, whispered wish, propelled him forward. He passed by Mama Leone's, where the scent of baking bread usually made his stomach rumble. But today, hunger was a distant sensation. He saw men in dark suits standing outside a storefront, their eyes scanning the street with an unnerving intensity, and he instinctively lowered his gaze, quickening his pace. Finally, he stood before the imposing doors of the Crimson Clover. The building itself seemed to exude an aura of quiet authority, its windows dark and opaque, offering no glimpse of the world within. He took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of stale cigar smoke and expensive cologne already seeping from beneath the doorframe. He pushed, and the heavy oak groaned in protest, revealing a dimly lit interior, a world apart from the bustling street. The sudden silence that greeted him was deafening, the collective gaze of powerful men of physical weight. He saw Tony Moretti, a figure of formidable elegance, and knew, with a child's unerring instinct, that he had found the man who held his mother's final dignity in his hands. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled snake ready to strike. But Marco, for Isabella, would not falter. The air in the Crimson Clover was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and expensive tobacco, a heady mix that usually signified power and leisure. But as Marco stood before Tony Moretti, the atmosphere crackled with an unspoken challenge. Tony, his initial shock giving way to a cool, assessing gaze, leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes scrutinizing the boy. His men, a phalanx of hardened faces, watched with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled impatience. No one dared to speak, waiting for their boss's lead. "Who are you, kid?" Tony's voice was a low rumble, surprisingly devoid of menace, yet carrying an undeniable authority. He took a slow drag from his cigar, the tip glowing a fierce orange in the dim light. Marco, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, met Tony's gaze directly. "My name is Marco Rossi, sir." His voice was small, but clear. "And my mother, she's Isabella Rossi." The name hung in the air. A sudden, unexpected chord struck in the carefully orchestrated symphony of Tony's world. The cigar, which had been poised for another drag, paused inches from his lips. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Tony's face. A shadow of recognition, perhaps, or a distant memory stirred. His eyes, which had been sharp and analytical, softened, just for a fraction of a second, before hardening again. But the change was there, a subtle shift that didn't escape the notice of his most observant lieutenants. "Isabella Rossi," Tony repeated, the name a whisper on his lips, as if testing its weight. He looked at Marco again, this time with a different intensity. "What about her?" She died last night, sir," Marco said, his voice catching on the last word. A single tear, unbidden, traced a path through the dirt on his cheek. "She was sick for a long time. The doctor said there was nothing more to do." He swallowed hard, forcing back the rising tide of grief. "We don't have any money. Not for a proper burial. The landlord said if we don't move her by tomorrow, they'll just take her away." his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. She deserves better. She was a good woman. Tony's gaze drifted from Marco's tear-streaked face to the thorny rose tattoo on his own neck, a silent, almost unconscious gesture. The men around the table exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't a shakedown, wasn't a rival gang, wasn't even a desperate plea for protection. This was a child, asking for dignity for his dead mother. It was raw, unvarnished human suffering, laid bare in a place where such vulnerability was usually a fatal weakness. Tony took a long, slow breath, the smoke curling around his head like a halo. Isabella Rossi. The name resonated with a forgotten echo, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried deep. His initial reaction, a practiced mask of indifference, began to crack, revealing a deeper, more complex man beneath. The silence that followed Marco's desperate plea was heavier than any threat, more profound than any command. Tony Moretti, a man accustomed to making swift, brutal decisions, found himself in an unfamiliar quandary. His men, usually quick to offer advice or carry out orders, remained uncharacteristically quiet, sensing the delicate balance of the moment. To simply hand over $5, a pittance to a man of Tony's wealth, would be an act of charity, an uncharacteristic display of softness that could be perceived as weakness in his brutal world. But to refuse a child's plea for his mother's dignity, especially Isabella Rossi's son, stirred something deep within him, a conflict between the hardened mob boss and a flicker of a past self. "Come with me, kid," Tony finally said, his voice low, rising from his chair with a fluid grace that belied his power. He extinguished his cigar in a crystal ashtray, the scent of its dying embers mingling with the tension in the room. His men watched, bewildered, as Tony led Marco out of the crimson clover and into the cool autumn air. A sleek black 1958 Lincoln Continental, polished to a mirror sheen, waited at the curb, its engine idling softly. Tony opened the back door, a gesture that surprised even his most loyal driver, and motioned for Marco to get in. Their destination was the Velvet Shadow, a more exclusive, dimly lit nightclub that Tony owned, a place where deals were struck in hushed tones and secrets were traded over clinking ice and smooth jazz. The club was a symphony of dark wood, plush velvet, and the melancholic wail of a saxophone. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, whiskey, and the ever-present aroma of cigar smoke. Tony led Marco to a secluded booth, far from the prying eyes and ears of his usual associates. He ordered a glass of milk for Marco and a double whiskey for himself, the amber liquid swirling invitingly in the crystal glass. "Tell me everything, Marco," Tony commanded, his voice softer now, almost paternal. "About your mother, about what happened." He watched the boy intently, searching for any hint of deceit, any angle. But all he saw was raw, unvarnished grief and a child's desperate hope. Marco, emboldened by Tony's unexpected gentleness, recounted the last few months. Isabella's worsening cough, the doctor's grim pronouncement, the dwindling savings, the landlord's heartless ultimatum. He spoke of his mother's quiet strength, her unwavering love, her dreams for him. As Marco spoke, Tony's internal conflict deepened. The code of the street dictated that sentimentality was a weakness, a luxury he couldn't afford. But the image of Isabella, a woman whose memory was now inextricably linked to this brave, desperate child, chipped away at his carefully constructed facade. He took a long swallow of whiskey, the burning liquid doing little to quell the fire of his conscience. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button. It helps me bring more stories like this to you. The jazz music in the Velvet Shadow seemed to grow more mournful, its saxophone wails echoing the turmoil in Tony Moretti's soul. He listened to Marco's story, his face a mask of practiced impassivity, but inside, a storm raged. The boy's words, simple and direct, were chipping away at the hardened layers Tony had built around himself over years of navigating the brutal world of organized crime. He saw not just a desperate child, but a reflection of a past he had tried to bury, a past connected to Isabella Rossi. "Isabella," Tony murmured, his voice barely audible above the music. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the smoky club faded, replaced by a vivid, almost painful memory. Flashback. It was a sweltering summer evening, years ago, when Tony was just a young, ambitious enforcer, still trying to make his bones. He had been involved in a street brawl, a messy affair that left him with a deep gash on his arm and a bruised ego. He'd stumbled into a small, quiet cafe, seeking refuge, and there she was, Isabella Rossi, working behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sparkling with a quiet intelligence. She had seen his injury, the blood seeping through his torn shirt, and without a word, she had gently led him to a back room, cleaned his wound, and bandaged it with a tenderness he hadn't experienced since his own mother had passed. She hadn't asked questions, hadn't judged. She had simply offered kindness. As she worked, she hummed a soft Italian lullaby, and Tony, hardened by the streets, felt a strange, unfamiliar peace. Before he left, she had pressed a small, dried rose into his hand, a simple gesture of hope. Even in the darkest places, she had said, her voice soft, beauty can bloom. That rose, long gone, was the inspiration for the thorny rose tattoo that now adorned his neck, a constant, private reminder of a moment of unexpected grace. Tony opened his eyes, the memory still sharp, the scent of Isabella's gentle perfume almost palpable. He looked at Marco, seeing Isabella's eyes, her quiet strength, reflected in her son, the weight of his reputation, the expectations of his men, the unwritten rules of his world, all of it pressed down on him. To help Marco would be to show a vulnerability that could be exploited. To refuse would be to betray a memory, a moment of pure human connection that had, in its own way, shaped him. He was a man who dealt in power, in fear, in loyalty, not in sentimentality. Yet here he was, confronted by a choice that transcended all of that. His hand instinctively went to the thorny rose on his neck, tracing its outline. The decision was not just about $5, it was about who Antonio Moretti truly was, beneath the expensive suits and the hardened exterior. The silence stretched, heavy with the unspoken conflict of a powerful man facing his own humanity. The air in The Velvet Shadow crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Tony Moretti, his hand still resting on the thorny rose tattoo, stared at Marco, a silent battle raging behind his dark eyes. The memory of Isabella, her quiet kindness, her simple gift of a dried rose, was a powerful counterpoint to the ruthless logic of his world. His men, who had followed him from the Crimson Clover, now stood at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. They had never seen their boss so conflicted. Finally, Tony took a deep breath, a decision forming, solidifying. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, not for a wad of bills, but for a small, ornate silver locket, its surface worn smooth with age. He opened it, revealing not a photograph, but a tiny, perfectly preserved dried rose petal nestled against a faded, handwritten note. He held it out to Marco. "Your mother gave me this, Marco," Tony said, his voice rough with emotion, a rare vulnerability exposed many years ago. "She told me, even in the darkest places, beauty can bloom. She was a good woman, Marco. A truly good woman." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his men, daring any of them to question his next move. "And no son of Isabella Rossi will ever have to beg for his mother's dignity." Then came the shocking revelation, the decisive action that would send ripples through the entire underworld. Tony didn't just give Marco $5. He stood up, his presence filling the room, and addressed his men. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice resonating with a newfound authority, "Isabella Rossi will have the finest funeral Little Italy has ever seen. A full, dignified service, every expense covered, and Marco here," he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, "will be taken care of. He is under my protection now." A collective gasp rippled through the room. His men, initially stunned, quickly understood the gravity of his words. This wasn't charity. This was an act of profound respect, a declaration that Isabella Rossi, through her son, had earned a place in Tony Moretti's unspoken code of honor. Marco, his eyes wide with disbelief, looked from the locket in his hand to Tony's resolute face. Tears, no longer of grief, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude, streamed down his face. He had asked for $5, a pittance, and had received a king's ransom, dignity, protection, and a future. The immediate consequence was a shift in the very air of the club. The jazz music, which had seemed so mournful, now played on, a backdrop to a moment of unexpected grace, a testament to the fact that even in the heart of the Mafia, a human heart could still beat with compassion. The days that followed October 17th, 1958, became a legend whispered in the hushed corners of Little Italy. Isabella Rossi's funeral was indeed the finest the neighborhood had ever witnessed. A gleaming black hearse, flanked by a procession of polished Cadillacs and Lincolns, carried her casket through the streets. The church, usually reserved for the most prominent families, was filled to capacity, not just with grieving neighbors, but with men in dark suits, their faces solemn, their presence a silent testament to Tony Moretti's decree. Fresh flowers, more than Marco had ever seen in his life, adorned the altar, their sweet fragrance filling the air. The priest, initially hesitant, performed the service with a newfound reverence, sensing the powerful forces at play. Tony Moretti stood at the back of the church, a silent, imposing figure, his eyes fixed on Marco, who sat in the front pew, his small hand clutching a rosary. The boy, dressed in a new, perfectly tailored suit, no longer bore the smudges of dirt or the hollow look of desperation. He was still grieving, but now he grieved with dignity, surrounded by a community that had rallied around him, spurred by the unexpected compassion of their most feared leader. This act, the $5 Requiem, as it came to be known, marked a profound transformation in Tony Moretti. He was still the ruthless, calculating mob boss, but something fundamental had shifted within him. The thorny rose tattoo on his neck, once a symbol of dangerous beauty, now carried a deeper meaning, a reminder of the delicate balance between power and humanity. His men, initially surprised by his decision, now regarded him with a new layer of respect, understanding that their boss possessed not just strength, but also a complex, unpredictable sense of honor. He had shown them that even in their world, there were lines, and some lines, drawn by a child's desperate plea and a forgotten memory, were not to be crossed. Marco Rossi's future was irrevocably altered. Tony didn't bring him into the family business. Instead, he ensured the boy received the best education money could buy, sending him to a reputable boarding school outside the city. He arranged for Marco to live with a distant, respectable aunt, providing for all his needs, ensuring he would never again know the gnawing fear of poverty. Tony would visit occasionally, a silent guardian, watching Marco grow into a fine young man, always remembering the boy who had dared to ask for $5. The legacy of that day was not just Isabella's dignified burial, but the quiet understanding that even the most hardened hearts could be touched, and that a simple act of courage could, against all odds, bloom into a profound and lasting change. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I post new Mafia stories 3 times a week. And so, the story of the $5 Requiem became more than just a tale of the New York Mafia. It became a legend, whispered from generation to generation in the bustling streets of Little Italy. It was a testament to the enduring power of a single desperate plea and the unexpected humanity that can emerge from the most unlikely of places. The memory of Isabella Rossi, the elegant woman whose life ended in quiet struggle, was honored not just by her son, but by the very man who embodied the city's dark underbelly. Tony Moretti, the formidable mob boss with the thorny rose tattoos, carried the weight of that day with him for the rest of his life. It didn't soften him entirely, for the world he inhabited demanded a certain ruthlessness, but it instilled in him a deeper, more nuanced understanding of honor and compassion. He became a figure of even greater complexity, a man capable of both immense cruelty and profound, unexpected kindness. And Marco Rossi, the brave 8-year-old who dared to confront a king, grew up to be a man of integrity, forever carrying the memory of his mother and the extraordinary act of grace that secured her final rest. He never forgot the man who, when faced with a choice between the cold logic of power and the warmth of a forgotten memory, chose humanity. This story, passed down through the years, reminds us that even in the grittiest corners of history, where shadows loom large and power reigns supreme, the human spirit can still find a way to shine through, illuminating the darkness with acts of courage, love, and an unexpected $5 Requiem. What did you think of Tony's choice? Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories from the golden age of organized crime, check out the video I'm recommending next. I'll see you there.